Welcome everybody to AFSO21 Radio. You're listening to the Weekend Wrap-Up.
Welcome everyone to another episode of the Weekend Wrap-Up here on AFSO21 Radio. I'm your host, Kevin Ferrara, and folks, today we've got a special guest on the show, someone I consider a friend, a colleague, an expert, if you will. I don't know if she'll agree to that, but Dr. Jamie DeWitt, who is an associate professor in Brody's Department of Pharmacology and Toxicology, she's been featured on several major platforms: National Public Radio, Bloomberg, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and Star News Online. Well, I'm elated that Dr. DeWitt has been able to take time out of her busy day, out of the lab, and be part of the show today, talking about Pfas and how it relates to firefighters and impact on the human body. So before we get started, let's go ahead and take a little bit of time to hear from our sponsor, Fire Department Coffee. And when we return, we'll be introducing Dr. Jamie DeWitt.
Firefighters work long shifts. That's the nature of the job. If your station is like most, coffee is what keeps you going. That's why you should check out Fire Department Coffee. Veteran owned and run by firefighters, Fire Department Coffee offers a wide variety of delicious coffee, including their signature line of spirit-infused coffee, all roasted by hand and delivered right to your door. Even better, 10% of net proceeds from every sale goes to benefit wounded, ill, or injured firefighters and other first responders. And they've got a special deal for the Weekend Wrap-Up listeners. Enter discount code AFSO21, that's AFSO21 at checkout to get 10% off your next order at Fire Department Coffee. FireDepartmentCoffee.com. That's FireDePT
Welcome to the show, Dr. DeWitt. If you could, how about you introduce yourself to the Weekend Wrap-Up listeners?
Well, hi there, Kevin. Thank you for inviting me to talk to you on your podcast. This is my first ever podcast, so I'm a little bit nervous because I really haven't been on one of these before. But I'm an associate professor in the Department of Pharmacology and Toxicology of the Brody School of Medicine at East Carolina University down here in Greenville, North Carolina.
Awesome. So typically, my guests are firefighters on the show. You are the first researcher. Well, let me back that up. I've had Dr. Graham Peasley on here talking about Pfas. So you're my second researcher. And for the listeners and viewers out there that don't know, remember, I was supposed to testify before Congress about Pfas, and the individual that replaced me is Dr. DeWitt. And we've had an opportunity, you and I, we've talked before in the past, before this podcast. And, I gave you compliments on the work that you've done down there at Congress. Cause I mean, if there was, I've said this, if there was anybody that I wanted to go ahead and replace me, looking back, it definitely would have been you, because you knocked it out of the park. You're familiar with Pfas. You've testified before Congress before. So, thanks to that. So let me just ask you, I mean, not everybody is a researcher. I mean, we're, firefighters, we're finding ourselves, at no choice but to research PFAS, PFOS, PFOA, all those other, weird acronyms out there. How did you get involved, as a researcher, growing up? Is that something that you wanted to do? And then how did you get to where you are today?
That's an interesting question. When I was a kid, I pictured myself as a grown-up, strangely, wearing a lab coat and carrying a clipboard. I guess occasionally I carry clipboards. I work on a committee here and sometimes have to carry my clipboard when I do inspections of people's labs, but I do wear a lab coat pretty frequently. So I knew that I wanted to do something in science, and really my educational trajectory was fairly non-traditional, because I was the first person in my family to go to college. So we didn't really have any models. I really didn't even know what a PhD was all about. I wanted to go to vet school because I lived in a small town, and you were a teacher, a nurse, a doctor, a lawyer, a vet. And when I got to college, I was not the most stellar student when I started out. I struggled a lot and realized, gosh, I'm too dumb for vet school, and ended up working in labs because I had work study and had to work my way through college. I've been working since I was 12, worked 2 jobs every summer, and got involved in some laboratories and loved lab work. I did a little bit of lab work in high school as well through a co-op position, but just love being in the laboratory, love answering questions that require you to pour stuff into tubes and poke and prod things. I've always been one of those kids that would poke and prod stuff on the side of the road, which is kind of gross. But I didn't really learn about toxicology until after I finished my undergraduate degree. When I graduated, I really didn't know what to do. I had bachelor's degrees in environmental science and biology, but really didn't have a great grade point when I graduated, and ended up working in labs, and then worked in environmental health and safety, took some continuing ed courses in a graduate program to try to raise my grade point. And through my job in environmental health and safety, I learned about this field called toxicology. And the more I learned about toxicology, the more I realized that this was a really great field for somebody like me who liked biology, sort of like chemistry, sort of like math, loved the environment, and loved working in a lab. And toxicology is one of those sciences that kind of brings everything together and includes a little bit of policy and is very applied. So for me, it was perfect. And then I ended up going to Indiana University and getting a PhD in environmental science with a focus on developmental neurotoxicology. And then because I was taking courses in our neuroscience program, my committee members said, "Oh, Jamie, you're only 7 credits away from a PhD in neuroscience." And I said, "So I get 2 PhDs?" And they said, "Yeah, do it." And I said, "Okay." So I have a PhD in environmental science and a PhD in neuroscience, again, not by planning, just by sort of tumbling in the right direction. And then I did postdoctoral training at the US EPA through a trainee agreement with University of North Carolina, and studied immunotoxicology. And then that's how I tumbled into PFAS.
Cool. That's 2 PhDs at the same time. My gosh.
Not planned, but it took 8 years. So it was not a short journey. It was 8 years, 4 years of courses. I taught a ton. I got a lot of really good experience. So yeah. So you can call me Doctor.
Doctor. That's awesome. So most of my listeners are firefighters, emergency responders out there. So when it comes to PFAS, I mean, can you explain, the firefighters out there, I've seen different sites out there that explain what PFAS is, and there's different definitions out there. I think, from the 30,000 foot view, we get it, but I'd like to hear from you, what, as a researcher, a doctor, someone that's really been involved in this. What is your definition of PFAS? And then can you continue on with that definition and explain how it relates to firefighters, through what your research and your work has found?
Sure. So PFAS stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, the PFAS. This is the current acronym that those of us in the scientific community who study PFAS use. They've been known in the past as PFCs. Some people call them PFAs. Some people refer to them as the individual PFAS, like PFOA, PFOS. But basically, a PFAS is a string of carbons where the hydrogens that have been stuck to the carbons are replaced with fluorines. And that carbon-fluorine bond is really, really strong, probably one of the strongest bonds known in chemistry. And there can be some little functional groups, so different oxygens and hydrogens added on to the end of PFAS. Some of them have oxygens in between the carbons, but these chemicals are strong and stable. They can withstand high heat, high energy, hazardous chemical conditions. Because of this strength and stability, they can be used in many different industrial and consumer applications. And as you know, they provide fire suppressant activities. They provide non-stick properties, and they also can be used to provide oil, grease, stain, water resistant properties as well. Because of these different properties, they're used in a variety of different products. We now know that PFAS are detectable in things like dental floss and contact lenses, cell phones, climbing ropes for people who like to climb mountains, non-stick coatings that you might have on pans or on textiles such as clothing or carpeting or furniture. They've been used in cosmetics. They've been used in outdoor gear. You know that they're a major constituent of aqueous film forming foams, which are used to put out high energy fires. They've also been used in medical devices that are implanted inside of your body. They can be used in some tubing or catheters that you might receive. They're also used in protective gear for, as you know, firefighters as well as healthcare workers. So they're in a lot of different products, and they're used in various processes also as surfactants to help things mix together better. And they can also be starting or raw materials for things like fluoropolymers or plastics that are made from these PFAS. So they're in 60 plus product use categories. So they've been kind of insinuated or instituted into so many different types of things that we use every day or for specialized uses.
You know, you mentioned, you know, as a former, you know, technical rescue instructor in the fire service, you mentioned, you know, rescue rope. And that's something, you know, I up to this point, I've never thought about. You know, it's because the rescue rope is synthetic. I mean, it's not natural fibers. And we use that extensively. You know, when I taught for 4 years, and, you know, firefighters, you know, they use it almost, you know, walk in any firehouse, they've got, you know, a bag of rope and everything. They're inspecting it. They're using it. Oftentimes we train with it. We may not be wearing gloves, you know, with personal protective equipment. So now we have that, as Dr. Graham Peasley said, you know, there's PFAS dust, and, you know, we've heard about it in turnout gear, but now we can almost, you know, is it safe to say PFAS dust could be in this rescue rope that we use in the firehouse as well?
Well, certainly anything that has PFAS in it or on it over time can degrade as it goes through its product use. And as products degrade, little pieces can become part of the dust that is in our home and our workplace, and we can certainly breathe those in. We really don't know a lot about how we get exposed to PFAS through dust or through other particles in the air, and we're still really learning about how PFAS might absorb through skin. So we have very few scientific studies that have asked how much PFAS gets into our bodies through our skin, how much PFAS gets into our bodies through the air or the dust that we breathe. So these are some areas of emerging research.
Got it. Okay. Do you, we'll just ask this question up front. Do you think we as a society overall, do you think we will ever get rid of PFAS, or is it just something we, you know, by no fault of our own, we're forced to live with?
Well, I think we can answer that question from kind of two perspectives. One is, if we stop production of PFAS right now, would our exposure go away? And the answer to that question is no, because there's still PFAS in the environment. There's PFAS in water, there's PFAS in soil, there's PFAS in products that have already been produced. So we're going to continue to get exposed, even if production stops right now today. And if we slowly phase out PFAS, then our exposure to some of the ones that have been phased out will reduce. But again, there's still going to be concentrations in the environment. And I think, can we stop exposure to PFAS? No. I think even if we stopped using them right now today, we're, like I said, still going to get exposed to what's in the environment. And then the second part of that question is, do we know enough about the replacement PFAS coming out to know that we don't have to worry about them 10, 20, 50, 100 years into the future? I know as a research toxicologist, I don't see all of the scientific evidence on these replacement compounds. And we know that there are some PFAS that have been measured in the environment for which we have almost no toxicological data, or I should say there's almost no toxicological data that I have ready access to. There may be toxicological data that has been produced by the companies that make these compounds, but because of confidential business information, I don't have access to those data.
Yep. And you know, that's something you bring up a good point, is that, you know, the access to this information is, you know, if you recall during the congressional hearing, the testimony, you know, Representative Wasserman, you know, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, you know, she asked the DOD what research, you know, are they doing, you know, in terms of impact on firefighters. And I was shocked to hear that they're really doing nothing, you know, and it's, you know, the DOD itself it sounded like they were really doing nothing. So we have to turn to, like you said, the manufacturers, but because of those industry trade secrets and all of this behind the scenes and the secret squirrel stuff that these manufacturers are doing, do you think they have an obligation? And I don't want to put you on the spot here, but do you think these manufacturers have an obligation, either morally, ethically, legally, to reveal what's in their product so end users like ourselves can make an informed and educated decision on, you know, what PPE to use or not to use? You know, it's ultimately it's up to us to put it on, but having that information, I think, would help. Do you think these companies should be held responsible to provide that?
Well, certainly, I understand that we have some regulations and guidelines in place to protect businesses, to ensure that they stay competitive either in their sector or stay competitive at the global level, because let's be honest, most businesses now do have to compete at a global level.
Yeah.
On the one hand, I do understand this concept of trade secrets and innovation so that we can ensure the profitability of companies and so that we can ensure that people have employment opportunities. But at the same time, I do think consumers have a right to know about the potential chemicals in products that they need to purchase. And I'm not just talking about products of convenience. If we're talking about PPE, we're talking about products that are essential for protecting somebody's life as they do their jobs. And especially when we think about COVID, I want to make sure that the doctor who's treating me for something has been protected from somebody who might have had COVID. So I think that the issue is that we need to reconsider maybe some of the laws that we have to ensure that consumers have as much protection as companies have with respect to finding out what's in products that they may be spending their money on. And I don't really know what that will entail. Some of our laws are pretty old and haven't been amended in a while. So it might be time to consider amending some of the laws for consumer protection and that are required of businesses as well.
I like that, because, you know, I don't think a lot of folks have thought about that, is that, you know, these and you know, when it comes to laws, like I said, you know, firefighters are firefighters, but now, you know, because of, you know, things that are going on, PFAS and some other things, we're becoming researchers. We're becoming lawyers. You know, we're having to do all of this research and at the same time still be firefighters and, you know, protect the public and everything. So it's really overwhelming for a lot of us. I know it has been for me, because, you know, for the past couple of years, you know, that it was about 2 years ago, 2 years or a little bit more, that I started learning about PFAS, and then it's just been nonstop, almost a runaway train, trying to research information, you know, trying to find the legalness of all of it. And, you know, I've got firefighters that are they're sending me messages left and right. They're, you know, text, Facebook, you know, all that, email, and they're, you know, asking all of these questions. And I'm like, okay, I don't know, but let me find out. And then I spend hours and days and weeks trying to find it. So To those that have sent me questions, I apologize. I haven't got back to you yet, but it's a slow process. So we're working on it. Trust me, we're working on it. But you see, you see how just overwhelming it can be to find all this. And going back to what you said, about the consumer protection laws, that's something I think, I haven't thought about. I'm certain others haven't thought about that, is that, how do we attack this? Looking at different ways of attacking it and getting to where we want to be. And, do we, go after the manufacturers? Maybe. Do we go after Congress and say, hey, can we pass legislation to like you said, similar legislation? I mean, if the companies are protected, why not protect the end users? Because if you don't have end users, what's the point of having your companies, right?
Well, and I think we also need to remember that we as consumers have a lot of power, because why do companies make products? To sell, to make money, to pay employees, to pay CEOs, etc. And when we as consumers decide that we don't want something, or that we don't want an ingredient in a product, some companies have been very responsive to that. And with respect to PFAS, there's actually many companies that have been very responsive to consumer desires to avoid PFAS, or at least avoid some of the PFAS that we now know are real problems for human health. And I could rattle off a list of companies, but I don't want to make any mistakes and name a wrong company. But I think we've seen commitments from some very large corporations to say, you know what, the evidence is clear enough for us. We're going to phase PFAS out of our products. We're not using them anymore. Yeah. And that's, I think, both a response to consumer desires, but I think it's also a desire for certain companies to be part of a sustainable world. And, I don't want to go too far down environmental policy, but we've got 7 some billion people on the planet. Yep. And if we want to see that population double, and it probably will, hopefully not within our lifetimes, we need strategies to ensure that we all can continue to live on this planet. And as far as I know, it's my right to breathe air that is healthy. It's my right to have water that is fresh and clean and free of chemicals. It's my right to be able to eat food that is healthful and without hazardous chemicals in it. So producing chemicals that are not sustainable, that are persistent, that are toxic, that have the potential to get into our bodies, really isn't part of a plan to keep the human population surviving on the planet for years to come, generations to come.
So let's talk about that a little bit. We know where PFAS comes from. We know the different ways that it can get into our bodies. But let's talk for a little bit. Once it's in our bodies, what should we, not just as firefighters, but really the human population, what should we be concerned with? Once that PFAS enters our body.
So this is, I find sometimes that explaining risk can be really challenging, explaining it to myself, explaining it to my family. And it's really challenging to explain risk over which an individual has very little control. So think about an airplane. A lot of people are afraid of flying, but they'll drive back and forth to work every day and not think anything about it, even though you're statistically more likely to get in an automobile accident than you are to get in an accident involving a plane. But because people aren't flying the plane, they have very little control. When there are plane accidents, a lot of people often perish. And so people are more afraid because of that lack of control and the numbers issue. And I think when we talk about environmental contaminants, they fall into a similar category. I have no control over my exposure, and a lot of people are getting exposed. But just because you're getting exposed doesn't mean that you will experience a health outcome such as cancer or immune suppression. But getting exposed changes your risk and means that you have an increased risk of developing diseases compared to somebody who's not exposed or who has very little exposure. And so the question is, okay, if I'm an exposed person and my risk is increased, what do I do? And I think that's really where people struggle. Well, am I going to get a disease? I don't know. How can I prevent it because I have exposure? And I think that's something that we need to work on as scientists and as a society in terms of explaining and then managing. But then back to your question about the health effects that we know are linked to exposure, and most of the linkages are to PFOA and PFOS, so the legacy or two of the long chain compounds. But there's emerging data to indicate that some of the replacements also produce the same types of health effects. So when PFAS get into our bodies, we know that they like to stick to proteins in our bodies. One of the proteins they like to stick to is called albumin. Albumin is sort of like a little taxi driver in your body. It helps to shuttle other proteins around. It's a really good carrier for a lot of hormones. And PFAS want to get onto that taxi, and they like to stick to albumin, which means that they can travel all the roads of your body through all your different blood vessels, where then they can go to other organs. And we're still trying to understand why they might hop off albumin and hop onto another protein, but they do that. And when they get into organs like the liver or the kidney, or when they interact with cells of the immune system, we know that they can produce changes in how those organs and systems function. And we describe those changes as adverse or undesirable. For the immune system, which is the system I study, we know that some of the functions of the immune system get reduced or suppressed. For example, we now have pretty good confidence that immune suppression is an outcome of exposure. And we know this because we've looked at levels of responses to vaccines go down in people who are exposed to PFAS. We also see this in experimental models. You give a vaccine, the response isn't as high as models that have no exposure. We also know that there are increases in cholesterol in people who are exposed. We know that there are risks of at least two types of cancers, kidney and testicular, but there's emerging data to suggest that bladder cancer, prostate cancer, breast cancer may also be concerns. We've seen increases in thyroid disease. Here in North Carolina, we've seen increases in thyroid cancer. We know that women who are pregnant may develop high blood pressure, which is known as preeclampsia. We've seen increases in ulcerative colitis, which is an autoimmune disease. So the immune system is weird. On one hand, it can be suppressed, and on the other hand, it can be inappropriately increased. So you see increases in allergy, asthma, autoimmune disease. We've seen signs of liver damage, so changes in enzymes to the liver. I think I've hit all of the major health outcomes that have been linked to PFAS. So here in the world of toxicology, we call them multi-system toxicants. So they don't just hit one organ. They seem to be able to hit many different organs and tissues. And we think it's because they can stick to all sorts of different proteins, which means that they can turn on signals and turn off signals at the wrong times, which then leads to diseases.
So that was a big list of risks and things that could happen. And you and I have talked about this before. I mean, we don't want to scare firefighters out there that says, hey, you've been exposed to PFAS, whether legacy or the long chain or the short chain. We know the Air Force, the DoD has switched from a long chain to a short chain firefighting foam, and now in a few years Congress has said they're going to a non-fluorinated firefighting foam. So yeah, we definitely don't want to scare everybody. But you and I had a conversation before, is that, when it comes to blood testing, the DoD is now doing blood testing, and they have been for the past year. We're into the second year now, or soon will be, in terms of the PFAS 6, the 6 different analytes that they're testing for. And some firefighters have sent me, their information, just the numbers. And I'm starting to see, the CDC and the NHANES reports. They had, what was, it looks like, their national average. And what firefighters have sent me is is well above those averages. And like I said, you and I talked about this before, and we said, really don't focus on the numbers, focus more on the signs and symptoms of what's going on, those changes in the body. And that's what, is that what firefighters should be looking at and talking and working with their physicians, or, if they're, or should they be worried if their numbers are high?
Well, first, even though I have 2 PhDs, I'm not a medical doctor. I'm in a medical school and I teach medical students, but I don't treat patients. And so I can talk about what I would do if I found out that I had elevated concentrations of PFAS in my blood.
Sure.
I would be concerned and want to know where I was exposed. And I would think, well, I work with them in the laboratory. Maybe I need to take more precautions in the laboratory. A firefighter likely knows that he or she is exposed through their workplace. And if they live in a community that's been contaminated with AFFF in terms of water, they may also be getting some exposure through their drinking water. Rather than focusing on those numbers, because what can you do? We don't have any pharmaceutical agents to give to make those numbers in your blood go down. Yeah. There's no treatments for getting rid of PFAS in your blood. I guess you could donate a bunch of blood, but then you're just going to be passing on that PFAS to somebody else. So if I found out that I had elevations of certain PFAS in my blood, I would first think about what risk factors I have in my life increase my risk for the diseases that we know are linked to PFAS. So do I have history of thyroid disease or cancer in my family? Do I have history of kidney cancer in my family? Fortunately, I don't have to worry about testicular cancer, but I might ask about bladder or breast cancer in my family. And I would evaluate, okay, these are the diseases that we've seen increased. Am I at risk for these diseases based on what I know about my family history? And then I might start thinking, okay, I usually drink a beer when I make dinner. Is alcohol a risk factor? And then I would think, well, when's the last time I had my thyroid hormone checked? When's the last time I had my cholesterol checked? And I would probably make plans to visit my healthcare provider and get some baseline information on my thyroid hormone concentrations, my liver enzymes, my kidney values, and see if any of them have been changed. So does it look like I might develop one of these diseases? And let's say I have increased cholesterol. We know that increased cholesterol has been linked to PFOA exposure. I would then do what I could to lower my cholesterol, whether it be with diet, exercise, or pharmaceutical agents. And I would probably want to visit my doctor annually if I have additional risk factors to make sure that those risk factors for that disease aren't actually turning into the disease. And also remember, many of the diseases that have been linked with PFAS are chronic diseases. And so once they develop, you'll have to treat them. And once they developed, you can't really get rid of them. You can just maybe tamp them down a little bit so that the signs and symptoms associated with it don't have a negative impact on other parts of your health or your quality of life. And, after saying all that, it actually sounds kind of sad, doesn't it? It almost sounds inevitable. But at the very least, you can get a handle on those risk factors and then do what you can to minimize them, to reduce the chances of developing diseases that we know are linked to PFAS.
And it's, that's a big challenge right now, because going back to the products, we spoke about before, is that, with firefighters, especially those that operate at airports. Well, almost every fire department now, fire apparatus has what they have, Class A, Class B foams, even for structural firefighting. So we really can't get away from it, we as firefighters, because we, the agents that we use, the PPE that has it, we've talked about rope. I mean, that's the challenge now that a lot of firefighters and departments are facing, is that, how do we prevent, reduce or eliminate this unnecessary exposure? And I've told a lot of firefighters, I mean, that's something you got to figure out locally, based on, what you're using and everything. There's no textbook answer, I don't think, with that. But let me ask you this. We talked about PFAS in the blood and, how it's in there for a while. Something firefighters are starting to hear, with PFAS is, it's called a forever chemical, and it's got a, there's a half-life associated with it. Can you sort of educate the firefighters, the listeners out there, what a half-life is, and, tie it in with PFAS, because there is no magic pill. I've told folks there's no magic pill. There's nothing that we can rid the body, of PFAS overnight. So if you could just explain, what half-life is and everything.
Sure. When we talk about half-life, we can talk about environmental half-life or biological half-life. Environmental half-life is how long it takes for a compound to degrade while it's in the environment. For PFAS, it's probably centuries, maybe decades for some, but probably centuries. DDT, for example, which is a chlorinated pesticide, which was used really copiously back before I was born, degrades in soil in about 30 years. Unfortunately, it degrades to byproducts that are generally a little bit more toxic. PFAS, longer than that. So that's one of the reasons that they've been termed forever chemicals, this really long environmental half-life. But in people, they also have a long biological half-life. If we talk about PFHXS, for example, which is a 6-carbon compound that's similar to PFOS, we've estimated that in humans, it has an 8.5-year half-life in our bodies. That means that if I was given a gram of PFHXS today, let's say a gram got into my body and was in my blood circulating around, and a gram is a lot, by the way. In 8.5 years, my body would have half a gram in it. In 17 years, my body would have 0.25 grams. And then I'm not going to do the math on the fly like that because I'll just look stupid. So that means every 8.5 years, half of what's there decreases by half. And so you can see if you start with a gram, you're going to be decades away before you're down to zero. And that's one of the concerns that we have about PFAS. So they last for a super long time in the environment. And when they get into our bodies, they hang out for years, which means they have many opportunities to interact with those proteins in our bodies, to shift off the things that we need to turn off and turn on those signals that really lead to those undesirable health outcomes. And so that's why we're pretty worried about PFAS from a toxicological perspective. So they have a long time to figure out they don't figure stuff out. So they're not like viruses or bacteria, but they have a long time to ping pong around inside of your body and interact. And if you're exposed every day and you're not getting rid of them very fast, you're going to build up, and eventually those concentrations will reach a point where they can turn on those undesirable effects that we call adverse health outcomes or toxicological effects.
So PFHXS, that's the one you talked about, right? So that's one of the PFAS 6 that the DoD firefighters are getting tested for. So, the DoD, and I'm not slamming on the DoD and everything. They're doing what they can, but they keep promoting. They keep saying we keep hearing PFOA. PFAS, PFOA, and PFOS. That's the two, but they never really talk about that PFHXS and these other PFAS chemicals and substances out there that it sounds like they're just as bad, maybe if not worse than PFOA and PFAS. Is that a fair statement that some of these, because I know during your testimony you said there's like 10,000 chemicals, PFAS chemicals. Just last year I thought there was only like 4 or 5, but when you said 10,000, I'm like, I literally sat back on my seat and I'm like, holy cow. It's so are there, of these other, I guess what I'm asking is, of these other chemicals, these PFAS chemicals that are being tested, if someone's blood, and it's going back to the numbers again, and I apologize for that, but if someone's numbers are low, like PFO and PFAS, but they seem high on the PFHXS or looking at the half-life, is that a concern? Because it's interesting when you say, yeah, if we just take 1 gram, you're looking at, years before it reduces. I guess I'm throwing multiple questions at you here. Is with firefighters, military firefighters, we know they're repeatedly exposed to it. So is it safe to say the more they're exposed to it, the longer that half-life?
Okay, let's try to break down some of the questions. So first, I think, the focus has been on PFOA and PFOS because there have been numerous entities and agencies that have done reviews of their health effects. So we know the US EPA has evaluated their health effects, and based on the evidence that they evaluated, they have come up with the lifetime health advisory, that 70 parts per trillion for either PFOA or PFOS, or PFOA and PFOS combined. And remember, this is a guidance for drinking water. This is not a legally enforceable regulatory standard, but a guidance to give purveyors of water the opportunity to say, okay, here's a level, let's try to get at least PFOA and PFOS at or below this level, because the US EPA says above this concentration, there may be some health concerns, and we want to try to make sure that our water is meeting those guidelines. The National Toxicology Program also has looked at PFOA and PFOS, and they looked at the immunotoxicological literature, and they've concluded that PFOA and PFOS are presumed to be immune hazards to humans. The International Agency for Research on Cancer, which is part of the World Health Organization, looked at PFOA and determined that it was a class 2B carcinogen, and I forget exactly, I think it's a probable human carcinogen. So they looked at the data evidence. The Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, or ATSDR, which is part of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, has looked at PFOA and PFOS as well as several other compounds, and has done what's known as a toxicological profile. So they've done a kind of a summative evaluation of the evidence. So we tend to focus on PFOA, PFOS, and related compounds because they've been the most studied. We know the most about them because there have been the most scientific studies published and conducted. PFHXS falls into the category of a long chain PFAS. It's a legacy PFAS. It has a very long biological half-life, and in studies that have been conducted with PFHXS, it produces outcomes very similar to PFOS. So it's regarded as toxic as PFOS.
Wow. Okay.
Some of the other compounds, 10,000. So one of the issues in the world of PFAS science is, well, how exactly is a PFAS classified? If you classify it this way, there's almost 10,000 compounds. If you classify it another way, there's just under 5,000. So the OECD has about 4,730 some compounds that they classify as PFAS. But the EPA's computational toxicology dashboard for PFAS lists just under 10,000 compounds for PFAS. The truth is probably somewhere in there, depending on, well, what do you mean when you say a PFAS? And I'm not a chemist, so I'm not going to try to give the precise definition.
Right.
So we know about the long chains. We know, and when I say long chains, I mean specifically those like PFOA and those like PFOS. And PFOA, I'm going to throw out some chemistry terms. PFOA is a perfluoroalkyl carboxylic acid, a PFCA. PFOS is a perfluoral sulfonic acid, a PFSA. So a PFSA with 6 or more carbons is considered a long chain, and a PFCA with 8 or more carbons is considered a long chain. This is a definition that the US EPA came up with for their stewardship agreement, which led to the voluntary phase out of long chain PFCAs and long chain PFSAs by the 8 major PFAS manufacturers here in the United States. And so there's general agreement that these at least 2 subclasses of PFAS are a problem because of their persistence, because of their bioaccumulation potential, which is their ability to move from the environment into living organisms, and because of what we know about their toxicity. But let's then take the thousands of other chemicals about which we know very little. By relative comparison, although a really great database was launched yesterday, I'm happy to share that website with you.
Okay.
Through some of the efforts of the Green Science Policy Institute and the Natural Resources Defense Council. They assess the literature for these understudied or short chain PFAS, and there's actually a surprising amount of literature. And the literature suggests that there are toxicological concerns with these compounds as well. So just because it's a short chain doesn't mean that it's safe. And I think really what we have to consider with PFAS is what is acceptable. And I think we talked about that a little bit.
Yeah.
These are synthetic compounds. They're not designed to be in our bodies. They're not designed to be in the environment. And so when we talk about protecting my health and your health, how much PFAS am I willing to let come into my body? How much is acceptable? And this is what agencies like the EPA do. They determine sort of that value between what is acceptable and unacceptable. And that is what is likely to be associated with undesirable health outcomes and what is unlikely or what has low likelihood of being associated with adverse health outcomes. And I made that correction there because, health risks are sort of like pregnancy, right? You get exposed and the risk is not zero because you've been exposed. Just like, you're pregnant or you're not. You don't have degrees of pregnancy. Just like, with toxicity of a hazardous compound, there may be effects that occur at the very low doses that we can't detect or measure, and that may not trigger adverse health outcomes, but it's not completely without effects. It's just those effects we consider to be acceptable and not likely to lead to disease. Gotcha. And I know that's probably way more into the weeds of toxicology than what you or your listeners want.
No, they are thirsty for information. Like I said, I get, and I appreciate, the listeners and all my friends out there, firefighter colleagues sending me this information, because that's the biggest thing is education. Like I said, we as firefighters, we're hungry, we're thirsty for more information on this, because at the end of the day, it's our bodies that are affected with this. So, we have to be aware of what these things can do to us. We have to, either through our organizations or personally, implement protective measures to reduce, or like we said, eliminate unnecessary exposure. I mean, at the end of the day, we're not going to, firefighters, until it's completely gone, PFAS is completely gone, we just have to work with it. But, while we're working with it, we can implement change to prevent that unnecessary exposure. So, just, I don't have another question. Just, if you could share just with the listeners, thoughts on your mind today as to, what's the next steps? Where are we going in the future with research, development, all that scientific jazz that, with PFAS, what you're doing, with PFAS and other work. And then also, how our listeners can follow your work. Because like I said, you're a wealth of information. It's, I look to you as a friend, a colleague, someone, that can really help the fire service with dealing with PFAS. And who knows, maybe something will pop up next week that, that we got to deal with chemical wise.
Yeah. So I think I'd probably be really boring to follow. You could follow me on Twitter, and it's all PFAS related, because I use my Twitter, and then I'm at Toxicology Chick, and I use that for sharing information about PFAS science. In terms of what we do in the lab, like I said, we look at the immune system and we do some descriptive work that is, for the first time, describing what happens in a living organism when there's exposure to a PFAS that has never been studied before. We're doing some work with some PFAS that have been found in the surface waters of North Carolina. We're working with one called PFMOAA, and it's got 3 carbons and an oxygen, so it's really short, but it was in the water of the Cape Fear River in pretty high concentration. So we've been asking questions about that. We're also working with another one called Naphion byproduct 2. And again, these are both byproducts. They're, as far as we know, not used as products in final, I guess, consumer products or something like that. The Naphion byproduct 2 has 7 carbons and 2 oxygens. And what we've seen so far is that it's not very pretty. It's pretty toxic to living organisms, and we're trying to describe that toxicity. We're also doing some work in the lab that's really nitty-gritty with respect to looking at molecular changes that occur in B cells. B cells are the part of your immune system that you want to be working really well right now, because they're the cells that are going to make the antibody when you get your COVID vaccine, and make sure that if you experience COVID out in the world, you have antibodies that can trigger your immune system to protect you. And we know that B cells don't make enough antibody when they're exposed to PFAS. So we're trying to figure out why. We're using these molecular approaches, and I'm not a molecular person, so it's uncomfortable science for me, but it's fun because we get to do these really cool techniques. So we're trying to figure out, why don't B cells make enough antibody? We're also looking at the developing immune system, because we know that kids are more at risk for some of the immune effects. And we're trying to figure out if some of these understudied PFAS also have effects on the developing immune system. In terms of where I think science is going to go next with PFAS, because there are so many individual compounds, I really think we have to understand and describe some of the molecular patterns that we think are consistent from PFAS to PFAS, so that we can use them to what's known as screen other PFAS. So let's say I discover this key molecular event that leads to a diminishment of antibody production by B cells, and that PFOA affects this event, PFOS affects this event, and let's say PFMOAA or Naphion byproduct 2 affects this event. Then I can take that little molecular event in a B cell, turn it into a little system in a dish, so that I could throw other PFAS in and say, okay, oh yeah, they affect this event. So that's a likely explanation or an alert that they may have effects on the immune system. And so these are molecular level approaches that we want to develop so that we can test more and more PFAS, and in a very rapid way. Some really smart people are working on some of those events through other types of tissues and systems, like the reproductive system and development. And I think that will really help us to get a better handle on some of the PFAS that we know are in the environment, are likely getting into people, but are understudied with respect to their health outcomes.
Cool. Well, Dr. DeWitt, this is the time in the episode where you get to answer some random questions, off the wall questions. So,
You didn't tell me about this.
so one of our sponsors, Poddex, as you can see here, they have, it's pretty cool. They got a deck of cards. There's a whole collection. They do episode suggestions, but this one is called What the Heck? So three cards. I'll let you pick 1 through 3, and we'll start off from there. And then you just answer the question however you want.
All right. Why don't we start with number 3?
Number 3. All right. Back in high school, what was the strangest thing someone could find in your locker?
Oh man, I don't know. I was pretty nerdy in high school, and I studied a lot. So probably something like a trapper keeper that was super well organized.
Yes. The young kids
Probably not
today don't
trained.
understand what a trapper keeper is. So.
I know I'm showing my age, right? I loved them because you could organize things by color, and that was pretty nerdy.
For those that don't know, jump on Google, look up trapper keeper. They were quite unique. Okay, 1 or 2. We got 2 cards left.
How about number 1?
Number 1. What is your favorite microwavable food?
So I don't actually eat microwavable food. I have a microwave and I reheat food in my microwave in glass dishes. I don't reheat in plastic. I don't purchase microwavable food. I actually can't remember the last time I purchased a microwavable food.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
I mean, I have my reasons, but I think the thing that I heat up most often in my microwave is dog and cat food, because we don't want our pets to have to eat cold food. So we heat it up a little bit for them, also in glass dishes.
Okay. Okay. Hey, I can respect that. No, that's awesome. Okay. Last question. Have you ever been bitten or attacked by an animal? And if so, what and why?
Well, yes, I've been bitten by snakes before, and probably pooped on by snakes quite a bit, because I'm one of those people that when I'm outside and I see a snake and I know it's not venomous, I try to catch it because I'm a scientist, right? I want to look at it, touch it. But I was bitten once by a tarantula.
What?
I was babysitting a friend's tarantulas, and I pulled one out, and I may have had some alcohol, and I was letting it crawl on me, and it was going to start running up my arm. So I grabbed it, and it didn't like that. And I saw its little fangs come out and sink into me, and then 2 little drops of blood. And I think it was like 2 a.m. and I called my friend, "Your tarantula bit me. What should I do?" And she's like, "Wash it. You don't have to worry about it. It's not really venomous enough to hurt you." But it was a moment of panic.
Wow. Wow. Yeah, I don't mind snakes. Spiders, that's a whole different story. I think the tarantula I could deal with. When we were deployed to Saudi Arabia, they had the camel spiders, as they call them. Those things were crazy. Yeah. We'd be sitting there in the day room, and they'd be crawling all over the walls and through the stalls. And I'm like, oh no. We'd throw boots at them to try to get them away and everything. But yeah. If it's, like I said, snakes are fine. I don't mind those. So
yeah,
well,
for me,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, for me, being in the South, roaches, I hate roaches. And we have American roaches everywhere.
Yep.
And centipedes. I like centipedes because they're good at killing other insects. But when I was in graduate school, I put one in a petri dish that we found in the lab and looked at it through the microscope. And I swear it looked me right in the eyes, and its little fangs went back and forth, and venom dripped from its fangs.
No.
And then every time I see a centipede, I know they're looking at me.
Oh my gosh.
Sorry.
No, that's cool. See, the listeners get to know you a little bit better. So it's
no centipedes for me, please, none.
Well, Dr. DeWitt, it's been a pleasure having you on the podcast. This is your first podcast, so you did fantastic. We got through it in one take. It's like I said, the work that you're doing out there, is amazing. I appreciate what you're doing, with research in terms of PFAS, how it affects firefighters. I really hope our listeners can appreciate that as well. And, we're going to have links to your pages, so they can not stalk you, but, track what you're doing out there with research and everything on this. Cause let's face it. I mean, we got to live with PFAS right now. So the more we're educated on it, I think the better we can manage that exposure and, take care of ourselves, or, the environment, and hopefully we have not, for our generation, but also future generations. Cause this isn't it is about us. We have to look at the bigger picture. They always say, leave the earth better than what you found it. So I think that, the work you're doing, we're definitely on track with that. So, last go around, any last things you want to say before we sign off here?
So I want to thank you for placing your trust in me as a scientist. I also want to thank others out there who look to me for information or to look to me to help with the understanding of PFAS. It's a responsibility that I take very seriously, and my work has shifted quite a bit as a result of my interactions with firefighters, both military and civilian, as well as people who advocate for the firefighter community, such as Diane Cotter, as well as people who live in communities who have been contaminated by PFAS. And I think as a scientist, we're taught not to be activists. We're taught to advocate with the science. But I think that if we're not being activists with the science, then I have to question, is my science doing the world good? Because to be honest, I'm a toxicologist because I want to make the world a better place. I want everybody to have opportunities for clean water, clean air, clean work environments, safe work environments. And so I feel like it's my responsibility to talk about the science related to PFAS, to encourage decision makers to make decisions that are going to be protective of environmental health. And by environmental health, I mean human health, wildlife health, occupational health, the whole environment. So I thank you and your listeners for having that trust in me. And I take it very seriously, and I appreciate it. And I think about it, and this is going to sound corny, but I think about it every day when I do my work, and keep that in mind.
Well, that goes a long way with us as firefighters, is the sincerity, the dedication. We're not knocking, other researchers and scientists out there, but when it comes to, the information, we look at individuals that have a passion for what they do and can, listen and appreciate our concerns and sort of, relate to what we're talking about. And so, I hope this isn't our only podcast. I'm putting the invite out there. It's an open invitation. Anytime you want to come back on the podcast, you've got a home here, to get your voice, your face out there, and let folks know, what's going on. So, again, I appreciate having you on the show.
Yeah, thank you so much. And if I have any updates to share, I'll definitely reach out to you.
Awesome. Well, folks, that's going to do it for another episode here in the Weekend Wrap Up. You've been listening to Dr. Jamie DeWitt, PFAS expert, as I will call her. So be sure to check out her work. We're going to have links on the podcast description, on whatever podcast platform you listen to, as well as YouTube. So with that, folks, as always, stay safe, keep supporting your local fire and emergency services. And until next time, we're out of here.
Veteran-owned and operated AFSO21 Agile Fire Service Organization for the 21st century applies their extensive background in fire protection and emergency services to deliver support with identifying, developing, implementing, and maintaining strategies and techniques essential to operate and sustain an emergency response organization. AFSO21 services include staffing analysis, risk assessment, standards of cover, training, management, and financial reviews. AFSO21 is prepared to support your organization with increasing your capabilities values. For more information, please go to AFSO21.com. That's AFSO21.com.